It was late October when I first heard about the old Miller house on the edge of town. I live in a small Midwestern town, one where everybody knows everybody, and stories tend to stick around for a long time. The Miller house had been abandoned for decades. Nobody dared live there, not since the tragic fire in the early 1950s that took the lives of the Miller family, a mother and her two children. The father had disappeared and was never found. People said the house was cursed, haunted by the spirits of those who died there. But I didn't believe in ghosts. Not not really. At least that's what I told myself. I'm a writer, and I figured the stories surrounding the Miller house were perfect for my next book. So I decided to spend a weekend there, alone, to get a feel for the atmosphere and maybe uncover some forgotten truths. I arrived at the house on a chilly Friday afternoon. The sky was gray, heavy with clouds threatening rain. The road leading to the house was a narrow dirt path winding through a thick forest of oaks and maples. I parked my car near the rusted iron gate, which creaked ominously when I pushed it open. The yard was overgrown with weeds and wild grass, and the house itself was a two-story wooden structure, blackened and scarred from the fire, but still standing. The front door hung slightly ajar, revealing a dark, smoky interior. I took my flashlight and stepped inside. The smell hit me immediately, a mix of charred wood, mildew, and something else I couldn't quite place. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, and dust motes floated in the weak sunlight streaming through the broken windows. The walls were covered in soot, and the remnants of furniture lay scattered and decayed. I pulled out my notebook and started jotting down observations. The fire had started on the ground floor. The entire kitchen area was destroyed, but the second floor had suffered less damage. I was hoping to find something, maybe old belongings or photographs, that could shed light on the family's story. As I climbed the narrow staircase, I felt a sudden drop in temperature. My breath fogged in the chilly air, and a shiver ran down my spine. Upstairs, the hallway was lined with doorways, most of the doors hanging off their hinges or completely missing. I explored the rooms one by one. In the master bedroom, the fireplace was cold and empty, but on the mantel I found a small, charred photograph. The edges were burned, but I could just make out the image of a woman holding a child. I slipped it into my pocket. The next room was a child's bedroom. The walls were painted pale blue, now faded and peeling. A broken rocking chair sat in the corner, and toys were scattered on the floor. Among the debris, I found a small music box, its wind-up key missing. As I examined it, a sudden sound echoed through the house, a faint, tinkling melody. I froze, my heart pounding. The music box was silent when I picked it up. The sound seemed to come from the hallway outside. I stepped out cautiously. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating. The floorboards creaked behind me as if someone was following, but when I turned, there was no one. I told myself it was my imagination and pressed on. In the last room, I found a diary, half burned but legible. The entries belonged to the mother, Evelyn Miller. She wrote about her love for her children, the strange noises in the house at night, and her growing fear that someone was watching them. One entry stood out. October 30th, I heard the music again tonight, soft and haunting. The children are afraid. I fear the fire that comes will not just be from flames. A chill ran through me. I closed the diary and decided to call it a day. That night, I set up my tent in the yard, unwilling to spend the night inside the house. As darkness fell, the forest around me grew quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by the sound of that music again, faint and distant, like a lullaby played on a broken music box. I grabbed my flashlight and peered into the darkness. The melody floated from the direction of the house. Against my better judgment, I walked toward it. The front door creaked open wider as I approached. Inside, the air was colder, and the darkness seemed to swallow my flashlight's beam. I followed the sound upstairs to the child's bedroom. The music stopped abruptly as I stepped inside. Suddenly, the room seemed to shift. The peeling wallpaper faded away, replaced by bright blue paint. The broken rocking chair rocked gently on its own. Then I saw her, a pale figure of a woman in an old-fashioned dress, cradling a small child. Their eyes were hollow, and their faces were expressionless. I stumbled back, heart racing, and the vision vanished. I ran outside, gasping for air. The night was still except for the whisper of the wind. The next morning, I spoke with a local historian who confirmed the Miller family's tragic story. The father was rumored to have been abusive, and some said he set the fire deliberately before disappearing into the night. They said Evelyn and the children's spirits were trapped, unable to find peace. I never went back to the Miller house after that weekend. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I can still hear the faint melody of that music box, a haunting reminder of the family that never escaped the flames. Story the end. It was early autumn in upstate New York when my cousin Sarah decided to spend a weekend at her late grandmother's farmhouse. The place was out in the country, surrounded by thick woods and fields, far from the nearest town. Sarah had inherited the house after her grandmother passed away a few years prior, but had never stayed there alone. She wanted to spend some time there to sort through the attic and decide what to keep or sell. I decided to join her for the weekend. It was a break from the city, and I was curious to see the place that Sarah had talked about so often. We drove up Friday afternoon, the sun dipping low behind the trees as we pulled into the long gravel driveway. The farmhouse looked exactly as Sarah had described, old but sturdy, with peeling white paint and dark green shutters. A big porch wrapped around the front, and the windows reflected the fading light. Inside, the smell of aged wood and something faintly sweet filled the air. The house creaked softly as we moved from room to room, unpacking a few things and setting up for the night. After dinner, Sarah suggested we explore the attic. She said she was sure there were some old family keepsakes and maybe some antiques worth holding on to. The attic was accessed by a narrow, steep staircase in the corner of the kitchen. The stairway was cramped and the ceiling low, but we made our way up with flashlights in hand. The attic was cluttered with boxes, old furniture draped in white sheets, and stacks of dusty books and photographs. As we sifted through the items, Sarah found an old diary tucked inside a wooden box. The leather cover was cracked and brittle, the pages yellowed with age. It belonged to her great-grandmother, Elizabeth, who had lived in the house in the early 1900s. Sarah started reading passages aloud by flashlight. The diary spoke of daily life, farming, family events, but also mentioned strange occurrences, unexplained noises, footsteps in empty rooms, and a feeling of being watched. Elizabeth had written about hearing soft singing late at night and seeing a shadowy figure near the back barn. We joked nervously about the ghost stories as the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and for a brief moment we heard a faint whisper, almost like a sigh coming from the far end of the attic. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, trying to steady my voice. Sarah nodded but smiled. "Probably just the house settling. These old places always do that." We packed up the diary and decided to head back downstairs. The house felt colder than before, and I noticed a chill that wasn't from the draft. We locked the attic door behind us and turned off the lights. Later that night, I was lying awake in the guest room when I heard footsteps outside the door. They were slow and deliberate, soft thuds on the wooden floor. I called out to Sarah, but no answer came. The footsteps stopped abruptly. Then after a pause, I heard the sound of a door creaking open somewhere else in the house. I got up, heart pounding, and crept into the hallway. The old wooden floorboards groaned underfoot, and the house seemed unnaturally quiet except for the faint creaks. I moved towards the kitchen, where I thought I heard the door open. There, by the back door, a shadow flickered against the wall. Tall, slender, but indistinct. It vanished the moment I blinked. I called Sarah again. This time she came out from her room, rubbing her eyes. "Did you hear that?" I asked. She nodded. "Yeah, I thought maybe it was a raccoon or something outside." We checked the back door. It was locked tight. Nothing seemed out of place. We went back to our rooms, but sleep was elusive. The next morning, Sarah was pale and quiet. Over breakfast, she admitted she had also heard footsteps in the middle of the night, and sometimes she felt like someone was standing in the corner of her room watching her. That afternoon, we explored the barn Elizabeth mentioned in the diary. It was a large wooden structure behind the house, with rusted farming tools hanging from the walls and old hay scattered on the floor. As we stepped inside, a sudden cold draft blew past us. I shivered, even though the sun was warm outside. Sarah pointed to a spot near the back where the floorboards were darker, worn from years of use. This must be where Elizabeth saw the figure, she said quietly. I didn't respond, feeling a weight in the air. We left the barn quickly, both of us unsettled. That evening, we sat by the fireplace reading more of the diary. Elizabeth's entries became more fearful toward the end, mentioning a presence that wouldn't leave her alone and strange symbols scratched into the wooden walls of the attic. Suddenly, the fire flickered and the room went icy cold. The shadows around us seemed to deepen, and the faint sound of a woman's voice, barely audible, drifted through the air. Elizabeth, it whispered. Sarah gasped and dropped the diary. The voice repeated softer now, almost pleading. I stood up, my skin crawling, and looked toward the corner where the shadows pooled. The whisper grew into a soft song, haunting and melodic. It filled the room, wrapping around us like a cold embrace. Who's there? I called out, voice trembling. The room remained still except for the song, which slowly faded into silence. That night, we left all the lights on and stayed close. But the next morning, we found the diary open on the floor, pages fluttering as if caught by a breeze, even though the windows were shut. One particular page caught my eye. It had a hastily drawn symbol matching the scratches Elizabeth described. Beneath it, a note in her handwriting read, "Do not trust the one who sings." We packed our things and left the farmhouse that day, unable to shake the feeling that something unseen had followed us. Years later, Sarah told me she still hears that faint singing sometimes, especially on quiet autumn nights. I never went back to that farmhouse, but sometimes late at night when the wind blows just right, I swear I can hear it too. That haunting melody carried on the breeze. Story the end. It was late October when Jenna moved into the old farmhouse on the outskirts of a small town in Pennsylvania. She'd inherited it from her late aunt, a woman Jenna barely knew but had always been curious about. The house was a rambling two-story with peeling white paint and a porch that sagged under the weight of years. To Jenna, it was charming in a worn-down way. And after the cramped city apartment she'd lived in for years, the idea of peace and quiet in the country was more than appealing. The first night she stayed there, she barely noticed the creaks and groans that old houses make when settling in. The wind howled softly outside, and the branches scraped against the windows like fingernails. But Jenna told herself it was nothing more than the house talking to itself. She unpacked some boxes, made a cup of tea, and tried to unwind. The town was small, and the nearest neighbor was a good half-mile away, so she wasn't expecting much noise. On the second night, as she settled into bed, she thought she heard a faint tapping on the window near the head of her bed. She paused, listening. It stopped. Must be a branch, she thought, pulling the blanket up and closing her eyes. But just as she was drifting off, a whisper came. So soft, she wasn't sure if she'd imagined it. The voice was female, distant, yet urgent. She couldn't make out the words. Her heart thudded, and she turned on the bedside lamp, scanning the dark corners of the room. Nothing. She told herself it was her imagination, or the wind. The next morning, over coffee, Jenna called the local hardware store to ask about how to fix the rattling window. The clerk, a middle-aged man with a slow drawl, told her the house had been empty for a long time before her aunt lived there, and that the town folks all said it was a little unsettled. And when Jenna pressed for details, he hesitated and said, "Old houses carry old memories, you know. Your aunt wasn't the first to live here, and sometimes those who left didn't go far." Jenna laughed it off, but curiosity gnawed at her. That afternoon, she went to the town library and dug into the archives, hoping to find old records about the house. She found that in the early 1900s, a woman named Mary Whitman had lived there with her husband and 2 children. According to an old newspaper clipping, Mary had died mysteriously in the house one cold November night. The cause of death was never clear. Some said pneumonia, others whispered more sinister rumors about her husband's temper and an argument gone wrong. Jenna felt a chill. The whispering voice from the night before suddenly felt less like a trick of the wind and more like a message. That night, as Jenna lay awake, the tapping came again, louder this time, on the window by her bed. She pulled the curtain back slowly, half expecting to see a branch or an animal. Instead, she saw a woman standing just outside, barely visible in the moonlight. She wore an old-fashioned dress, pale and flowing, and her hair seemed to drift in a breeze Jenna couldn't feel. Jenna froze. The woman's eyes met hers, wide and sorrowful, before she slowly faded away. Heart pounding, Jenna shut the curtain and sat up, clutching the blanket. She told herself she was tired or that the long day had made her see things. But deep down, she knew something was there. Over the next few nights, the phenomena increased. Jenna heard footsteps in the hallway when she was alone, felt cold spots that made her breath fog in the air, and sometimes smelled a faint scent of lilacs, her aunt's favorite flower, according to family stories, but odd because there were no flowers anywhere near the house. One evening, Jenna was in the kitchen washing dishes when she heard a soft sobbing coming from the living room. She turned and saw the silhouette of a woman sitting on the old rocking chair, head in hands. Jenna's voice caught in her throat. "Mary?" she whispered. The figure looked up, and this time Jenna could make out the face, tear-streaked and pale, eyes full of pain and longing. She wanted to reach out to comfort, but as she moved forward, the figure vanished. Jenna knew she needed answers. She contacted a local historian who specialized in the town's history. When Jenna recounted her experiences, the historian nodded slowly and told her the full story of Mary Whitman. Mary's life had been tragic. Her husband, a harsh man, had become abusive after losing his job. One winter, during a fierce argument, Mary ran into the woods with her children, desperate to escape. She never returned. Her body was found days later near a frozen creek. The children never recovered. "What do you think happened here?" Jenna asked the historian. He looked solemn. "Some say her spirit never left, trapped by grief and fear, waiting for peace. And sometimes houses like this hold on to those spirits, especially where there's unfinished business." That night, Jenna sat by the fireplace, the house quiet except for the crackling logs. She spoke softly to the air. "Mary, if you're here, I want to help you find peace." The house seemed to hold its breath. Suddenly, the room grew cold, and the faint scent of lilacs filled the air. A soft voice whispered, "Thank you." Jenna felt a warmth spread through her, a calm settling like a gentle wave. For the first time, the house felt at peace. From that night on, the tapping stopped, the cold spots disappeared, and the presence in the house felt comforting rather than frightening. Jenna slept deeply, knowing she had helped someone finally rest. And though she never saw Mary again, Jenna kept a vase of lilacs by the window, a quiet tribute to the woman whose story had reached across time and touched her own. Story the end. The house stood at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in a small town in Pennsylvania, an old farmhouse that had seen better days. Its white paint was chipped and faded, and the wooden porch sagged under the weight of time. The neighbors rarely spoke of it, and those who did used hushed tones and avoided looking directly at it. It was a place with reputation, one that gave most folks the kind of unease you couldn't shake off, no matter how much you tried. Sarah moved there in late October, just before Halloween, hoping to start over. She was a nurse in her early 30s, recently divorced, and needed a change from the cramped apartment she'd been living in the city. The house was cheap, maybe too cheap, but she liked the space and the quiet. It was a fresh start. The first few days were uneventful. She spent her time unpacking, fixing the creaky hinges on doors, and slowly making the place livable. The wind howled through the surrounding woods at night, rattling the windows, but Sarah found it peaceful, maybe even comforting. On her third night, she woke up suddenly, her body stiff with a cold sweat. The clock on her bedside table read 3:17 a.m. She couldn't move at first, frozen by an overwhelming sense of dread. The room was pitch black, but she thought she saw a shadow flicker at the edge of her vision. The air felt thick, heavy. Trying to shake off the feeling, she reached for her phone and flicked on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the corner of the room where nothing should be. Yet, the shadow seemed to pulse, grow clearer for a moment before dissolving again. Sarah told herself it was just her mind playing tricks, but sleep didn't come back easily. Over the next few nights, the strange sensations persisted. Footsteps echoed in the hallways when she was alone. Doors she was sure she had closed would be open in the morning. And there was always that cold spot, a particular corner near the staircase where the temperature would drop sharply, no matter how high she cranked the heat. She began to research the house's history at the local library during the day. The old records showed it had been built in the early 1900s and had belonged to a farming family, the Carters. There was mention of a tragedy. The youngest daughter, Lily Carter, had died suddenly of pneumonia in the winter of 1923. After that, the family sold the house and moved away. Sarah felt a pang of sadness. She could imagine a little girl, sick and scared, trapped in this old house all those years ago. One evening, as Sarah was preparing dinner, the lights flickered. The television turned on by itself, playing a black and white static image that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. The volume was low, but through the static, she thought she heard a soft humming, like a lullaby. Shaken, she turned the TV off and went to check the windows and doors. Everything was locked tight. When she returned to the kitchen, she noticed something strange. A small, old-fashioned music box sitting on the counter. She was sure it hadn't been there before. The music box was delicate, painted pale blue with tiny white flowers. When she opened the lid, a tinny melody played. The same lullaby she'd heard on the TV moments before. Sarah's heart hammered as she remembered the stories of Lily. Could this be some kind of message? She spent the next day visiting the local historical society, hoping to find more about Lily Carter. The curator showed her some old photographs. One was a picture of Lily in a blue dress holding a music box. That night, Sarah placed the music box on her nightstand and wound it up. The melody filled the room. As it played, she felt a presence near her bed, warm, gentle, and sorrowful. Suddenly, a small hand reached out from the darkness and touched her arm. She gasped but didn't pull away. A soft voice whispered, "Thank you." Sarah's fear melted into compassion. She spoke softly, "I'm here, Lily. I want to help you." The voice replied, "I'm lonely. I want to go home." Sarah knew then what she had to do. The next morning, she visited the local cemetery and found the Carter family plot. Lily's grave was simple but adorned with faded flowers. Sarah brought the music box and placed it gently on the headstone. As she stood there, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faintest sound of a child's laughter. For the first time since moving into the house, Sarah felt peace. Back at the house, the cold spot was gone. The footsteps ceased. The air felt lighter, warmer. That night, as Sarah drifted to sleep, the music box played softly on her nightstand. A lullaby carried on the wind, a final farewell from a spirit finally at rest. Story the end. It was the summer of 2015 when I first moved into the old farmhouse just outside of a tiny town in upstate New York. I'd grown tired of city life. Constant noise, the unending rush, the feeling that everyone was just too busy to notice anything real, and wanted a change. The farmhouse was cheap, almost suspiciously so, but my budget was tight, and I figured I could fix it up over time. The owner was an elderly woman who'd passed away the year before, and the place had sat empty since then. The neighbors said it was peaceful out there, though some hinted the house had a history, but nothing concrete. I didn't care much for local folklore. I just wanted to live somewhere quiet. The first few days were uneventful. The house creaked with age. Floors that settled, pipes that groaned, but nothing out of the ordinary for a place built over 100 years ago. I spent my days unpacking and cleaning, and my nights in a strange kind of silence I wasn't used to. The darkness outside felt thick, almost pressing against the windows, but I chalked that up to my city nerves. On the third night, something changed. I was lying in bed, scrolling on my phone, when I heard it, a faint tapping sound like fingernails on wood. It was coming from the kitchen, downstairs. I froze, listening. The clock read 1:17 a.m. I told myself it was the old house settling, maybe a branch hitting the window, but the tapping kept coming, steady and deliberate. I got up and grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand. The floorboards groaned beneath my feet as I crept down the hallway. The kitchen was dark except for the pale light of the moon filtering through the window. The tapping stopped as soon as I turned on the flashlight. I checked the windows and doors. All were locked. No sign of anything or anyone. The next morning, I told myself I was imagining things. The quiet had gotten to me. That weekend, I decided to explore the property a bit. The backyard was large, overgrown with wildflowers and old apple trees. As I walked near the edge of the woods behind the house, I found something odd. A small stone well, partially covered in vines. It looked ancient. Curious, I peered down but couldn't see the bottom. I made a mental note to ask the neighbors about it. Back inside, as the days passed, I noticed little things, things that didn't quite add up. The radio I'd left on the kitchen counter would sometimes switch stations on its own. The old grandfather clock in the living room, which I hadn't even wound, would strike odd hours, sometimes at 3 a.m., sometimes 9 p.m., and sometimes not at all. One night, around 11:30 p.m., I heard footsteps outside the bedroom window. The sound was soft, like someone walking slowly on the gravel path that ran along the side of the house. I looked out, but the yard was empty and still. The shadows of the trees danced in the moonlight, but no one was there. I tried not to let it bother me. Then came the dreams. They started about a week after I moved in, always the same. I would find myself standing at the edge of that stone well. The air around it was thick with fog, and I could hear faint voices whispering, calling out names I didn't recognize. Sometimes a hand would reach up from the darkness inside, grasping toward me. I would wake up gasping, heart pounding. I mentioned the dreams to a neighbor, Mrs. Harper, a kind woman in her 70s who lived a few houses down. She looked at me carefully, then said, "That old well's been there for longer than anyone can remember. Folks say it's cursed." I laughed it off, but I could tell she wasn't joking. That night, the house was colder than usual. I pulled the blankets tight and tried to sleep, but the whispers from my dreams seemed to seep into reality. I thought I heard someone calling my name faintly, coming from the direction of the well. I didn't want to look, didn't want to go outside, so I stayed under the covers, eyes squeezed shut. The next day, I found my dog, a black lab named Max, staring fixedly at the back door, growling low in his throat. He wouldn't come to me or even move, just kept watching. When I finally opened the door to calm him, the temperature dropped sharply. The air felt damp and heavy, and then I saw it, a faint outline of a figure standing just beyond the tree line near the well, pale, translucent, almost shimmering in the sunlight. Before I could blink, it was gone. I told myself it was my imagination. I was under stress. I'd lost a lot lately. Maybe I was seeing things, but Max refused to go near the backyard after that. One evening, a week later, I stayed up late reading by the fireplace. Around midnight, I heard the taps again, this time louder, more insistent, coming from the front door. I tried to ignore it, but the sound grew until it was like someone was pounding on the wood. I wrapped myself in a blanket and sat frozen. Then the door creaked open. Not all the way, but just enough to let a cold wind rush in. I stood up slowly, heart racing, and saw footprints in the dust on the floor, bare footprints, damp, leading from the door toward the living room. There was no one there. I ran outside with a flashlight, shining it around the porch and yard. Nothing. No footprints in the gravel, no sign of anyone. Just the well, half hidden in the shadows. That night, I slept with the doors locked and windows shut tight. But the next morning, I woke to find the front door wide open. I was beginning to realize this wasn't just an old house playing tricks. I called a local historian, a man named Charles, who specialized in the history of the area. He came out a few days later and told me stories I hadn't heard before about the woman who once lived in the farmhouse, a young mother named Evelyn who had lost her child to drowning in that very well over a century ago. The community whispered about how she'd gone mad with grief, wandering the property late at night, calling out for her baby. Charles said the well was sealed decades ago, but the memory of that tragedy never left the land. That night, I sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the dark outline of the well. The air was still, too still. Then a faint scent of roses, sweet and heavy, drifted to me on the breeze. I shivered. Suddenly, the sound of a trying broke the silence, distant but clear. I jumped up and shone my flashlight toward the well. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure leaning over the edge, a woman's form, hair loose, face pale and anguished. I blinked, and it was gone. The crying stopped. From that night on, things settled. The tapping ceased. The whispers faded. Max stopped growling at the backyard. It was as if acknowledging the presence, understanding the grief, had somehow soothed it. I stayed in that farmhouse for 2 more years before moving to a city closer to work. But sometimes when the wind is just right and the moon is full, I swear I still smell roses in the air. And when I close my eyes at night, I can hear a soft lullaby, carried on the wind from a time long past. Story the end. I moved to northern Idaho in the fall of 2018 after a long, exhausting divorce and the slow death of my IT job in Seattle. The company folded after 10 years, and I found myself stuck with an overpriced apartment, no steady income, and a growing bitterness I didn't like seeing in myself. I needed a reset. A friend of mine from college, Pete, had inherited his grandparents' old property out near Priest Lake and offered me the place for cheap rent while I got back on my feet. It was remote, quiet, and the kind of small town life I thought would calm the storm in my head. So I packed what little I cared to bring, left the city behind, and made the 8-hour drive to a little town most people have never heard of. The property itself was charming in a weird, eerie way. It sat back off a dirt road behind a thick wall of pine trees, the kind of place that didn't see many visitors unless they were lost. The main house was a 2-story white structure that had clearly seen better days. Peeling paint, a front porch sagging in the middle, and shuttered windows that creaked whenever the wind picked up. It wasn't falling apart, but it wasn't exactly cozy either. Pete said the house had been unoccupied since his grandmother died in 2004. Before that, his grandfather passed in the mid-90s. It was a time capsule. Everything from the faded wallpaper to the rotary phone mounted on the kitchen wall screamed 1970s. He left the keys under a rusted frog statue on the porch. When I opened the front door, the place smelled like dust and pine needles. The air was still and heavy. I didn't know it at the time, but something about that air never changed, no matter how long I stayed. The first few nights were uneventful. I cleaned during the day, set up my laptop at the old dining room table, and spent most evenings watching movies on my tablet. There was no Wi-Fi, no cable, and cell reception was a joke unless I stood in the driveway and didn't move. I didn't mind. I welcomed the quiet, especially after years of honking cars, crowded bars, and late-night yelling matches with my ex. For a while, it felt like I was finally breathing again. But then, small things began to bother me. It started with the lights. The power in the house was spotty, sure. Old wiring and rural infrastructure, I told myself. But the way the bulbs dimmed didn't feel like a surge. They would go low, almost out, and then brighten, sometimes flickering like they were reacting to movement. A few times they dimmed as I walked past, then brightened when I stopped. At first, I figured it was coincidence. Then it started happening every time I entered the living room. I even tested it. Walk in, light dims. Stop walking, light returns. I told myself it was faulty wiring, but it left a chill crawling up my neck. The sound of footsteps upstairs came next. It was around midnight. I was lying in bed reading when I heard the unmistakable sound of someone walking across the floor above me. Not creaks or settling wood, but real, deliberate steps. I froze. There was no one else in the house. I hadn't had a single visitor, and I always locked the doors at night. I grabbed a flashlight and the old fireplace poker from some wood stove and climbed the stairs. Nothing. No open windows, no raccoon or squirrel, just that strange, stagnant air and the faint smell of mothballs and something older. I searched every closet, checked under the bed in the guest room, even opened the old attic hatch with a broom handle. Empty. That would have been enough to make most people leave, but I was stubborn. I told myself I was being dramatic, that isolation was messing with my head. I tried to laugh it off, call it country living. A week later, I stopped laughing. It was a Thursday night. I remember because the wind had picked up hard and was slamming pine cones against the house like hail. I couldn't sleep. I got up around 2 a.m. to get a glass of water. The hallway was pitch black, but as I stepped into it, I noticed something strange. The smell of roses. Not faint, not passing. It was strong, almost perfume-like. It stopped me in my tracks. There were no flowers in the house. I hadn't bought anything scented. The smell was entirely out of place. And then I saw her. At the end of the hallway, near the old mirror hanging beside the stairwell, was the silhouette of a woman. She wasn't moving, just standing. Her outline was faint, barely visible, but enough to be unmistakable. Long dress, hair pulled up, shoulders squared. I couldn't see her face. I couldn't move. My body froze, even as every instinct screamed at me to run. Then in a blink, she was gone. I backed up into my bedroom, slammed the door, and sat in the corner with the lamp on until sunrise. I didn't sleep that night. I barely breathed. I tried to tell Pete the next day. He didn't laugh, but he didn't exactly believe me either. He said his grandmother had died in the house, but peacefully. No drama, no haunting past. He chalked it up to stress and said if I really wanted to leave, he'd understand. But something told me not to. I wanted to understand what was happening. I had no job, no family calling me home, and nowhere else to go. So I stayed. The woman appeared again 3 nights later. This time I was ready, or at least expecting it. It was around 3 a.m. I was awake, lying still in bed, the house completely silent. Then the smell returned. Roses, even stronger than before. I sat up and turned on the lamp. There she was, standing just outside my bedroom doorway. Her face was visible now, pale, with sunken eyes and lips slightly parted like she was whispering something. She didn't move, didn't blink. I stared at her for what felt like a full minute. Then she stepped back into the darkness and vanished. My breath caught in my throat. My skin felt like ice. I didn't sleep again. Over the next 2 weeks, things escalated. I started hearing whispers, soft and unintelligible, just beneath the threshold of human hearing. They came from the vents, the closets, sometimes from inside the walls. Lights would flicker violently when I passed through the hallway. Objects moved. A small dish of keys I kept on the kitchen table slid across the surface while I was watching. Not fell. Slid. One night, I found every cabinet and drawer in the kitchen wide open. I had closed them all before bed. No wind, no quake, nothing explainable. The worst night came in mid-November. I had started recording audio at night, hoping to capture something I could use to prove I wasn't losing it. I'd leave my phone recording while I slept and play it back the next day. For a while, it just picked up wind, the occasional creak, my own snoring. Then one morning, I played a file back and heard something new. At 3:11 a.m., there was a voice. Not whispering this time. Clear. Female. It said my name. Daniel. Just once. And then breathing. I dropped the phone. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped my coffee too. I rewound it and played it again. Same thing. Daniel. Not angry, not pleading, just calling. Like someone trying to wake me. The next night I didn't sleep at all. I sat up in the living room with every light on, fireplace burning, eyes locked on every doorway. Around 3 a.m., the room got cold. So cold I could see my breath. The fire was still burning. The windows were shut, but the temperature dropped like a freezer door had been opened. And then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, from the hallway. They stopped just beyond the archway into the living room. I stared, paralyzed. Then she stepped in. Same woman, same old-fashioned dress. But this time her mouth moved. "You shouldn't be here," she said. Her voice didn't echo. It was flat, emotionless, like it came from a record player. I tried to speak, but couldn't. My jaw locked. I wanted to ask her who she was, what she wanted, but my body wouldn't respond. She tilted her head slightly, then turned and walked back into the darkness. I could hear her footsteps fade down the hall, then up the stairs. I packed a bag the next morning. I didn't leave Idaho entirely. I found a small apartment in Sandpoint and started working part-time at a bookstore downtown. I told Pete I couldn't stay at the house anymore. I didn't tell him why. He didn't press. A few months later, he called me. "I think someone's been staying at the house," he said. I went up to check on it, and the front door was wide open, but nothing was stolen. Just moved around. I asked him what he meant. He said the upstairs guest bed had been made, like someone had recently slept there. The old record player in the parlor was spinning, no sound, just turning. And there were rose petals on the floor. He changed the locks and had a local friend check in weekly, but I don't think he stayed there again. Neither did I. Even now, sometimes I wake up around 3 a.m. and for a second, I swear I smell roses. It always passes, but it leaves me staring at the ceiling, waiting for footsteps that never come. Story the end. I was never the kind of person who believed in ghost stories. Not really. I grew up in a working-class neighborhood just outside Columbus, Ohio, and my parents were no-nonsense, blue-collar types who didn't leave much room for superstition. We didn't talk about spirits or curses. When something bad happened, it was just bad luck or bad timing. That's how I saw it for most of my life, up until the fall of 2013. At the time, I had just moved into a small one-bedroom apartment on the west side of Dayton. It was cheap, a little rundown, but it had a certain charm I liked. The hardwood floors creaked, the kitchen tiles were cracked in spots, and the furnace rattled whenever it kicked on. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. And for a 29-year-old trying to get back on his feet after a messy breakup, that was enough. The building itself was older, probably 1920s, with thick walls, high ceilings, and stained glass windows that let in these weirdly colored shadows in the late afternoon. The landlord, a quiet guy in his 60s named Rick, told me there were only 6 units in the entire place, and most tenants kept to themselves. I didn't think much about it then. I liked my privacy. The first couple weeks were uneventful. I was working long hours as a delivery driver and usually came home exhausted. I'd eat a frozen dinner, watch something brainless on Netflix, and fall asleep in front of the TV. But then, small things started happening. Little disturbances I couldn't quite explain. Lights flickering, the sound of shuffling in the hallway when no one else was around, a faint tapping on my bedroom wall at night, too rhythmic to be the pipes. I brushed it all off as the quirks of an old building. That's what I told myself anyway. But then things escalated. It started with the cold spots. I'd walk into my bedroom and it would feel like I stepped into a refrigerator. Not always. Just some nights. I'd check the windows. Closed. No draft. The thermostat would read 72, but it felt closer to 50. Sometimes I'd feel it move around the room, like a breeze that didn't come from anywhere. The worst was when I'd feel it pass through me, like walking into a sheet of ice. One night in October, I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of something falling. It wasn't loud, but sharp enough to jolt me upright. I turned on the bedside lamp and looked around. Everything seemed in place. Then I noticed the picture frame that had been on my nightstand, a photo of me and my sister at my college graduation. It was face down on the floor, the glass cracked. It hadn't fallen far, but what got me was that it had landed nearly 4 feet away from the nightstand, as if it had been thrown. I didn't sleep well after that. A few days later, I was in the kitchen pouring a cup of coffee when I heard a whisper behind me. Just a single word, "Hey." I turned around instantly. Nothing. The hairs on my arms stood up and my stomach dropped. It wasn't my imagination. It was clear, crisp. A man's voice, soft and low, like someone trying not to wake a sleeping baby. I didn't have roommates. I lived alone. That's when I started asking questions. I went down to the basement one afternoon to do laundry. It was an old shared space, dimly lit and half-exposed brick with exposed pipes. There was one washer and one dryer, both from the 80s by the look of them. While I waited, Rick came down to check the circuit box. I struck up a conversation, trying to be casual. Hey, Rick, has anyone ever, said this building's haunted or anything?" He looked up from the panel, frowning slightly. "Haunted?" he repeated. "Yeah, just weird noises, cold spots, things moving around." He studied me a second longer, then shrugged. "Old buildings make noises, pipes, foundation shifts, you hear stuff." That was all he said. I didn't press. But the way he avoided eye contact told me he knew more than he was letting on. That night, I left my bedroom door cracked open. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself there was nothing to be afraid of. I left the TV on low volume, just white noise. I was almost asleep when I heard something walk past my door. I say, walk, because that's exactly what it sounded like. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps on the hardwood floor. No creaks, no dragging, just soft, unmistakable thuds. I sat up in bed, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. Then the door creaked open, just an inch or two. I stared at it, my pulse pounding in my ears. Nothing. I grabbed the small flashlight I kept in the nightstand and clicked it on, aiming it toward the door. The hallway was empty, but I could feel something. Not see it, not hear it, but feel it, like someone was there, just out of sight. I didn't sleep that night at all. Over the next few weeks, things got worse. I started hearing voices, not full conversations, just fragments. A child laughing, a woman sobbing, once a man shouting in what sounded like pain. Every time I checked, there was nothing. No neighbors, no TVs on, just me. The most terrifying moment came one night around Thanksgiving. I had taken a few days off work and was up late, cleaning out the kitchen cabinets. I had a small radio playing oldies, nothing too loud. Around midnight, the radio suddenly cut out, replaced by static. I tapped it. Nothing. Then I heard a thump in the living room. I walked out slowly, holding my breath. There, standing in the middle of the room, was a man. He was facing away from me, wearing a dark suit, his hair slicked back like it was the 1950s. He wasn't moving. Just standing there. I froze. The man slowly turned his head over his shoulder, and that's when I saw it. His face wasn't right. It was stretched somehow as if pulled into a permanent scream. His eyes were hollow, black pits. The skin around his mouth was torn and split. Blood, or something like it, ran down his neck. Then he was gone. No fade out, no movement, just vanished. 1 second he was there, the next he wasn't. I collapsed to my knees and vomited. I don't even remember crawling back into bed. The next morning, I packed a bag and drove to my sister's place in Cincinnati without telling anyone. I stayed there for 2 nights. No nightmares, no cold spots, no voices, just peace. I didn't want to go back, but I had to. My lease wasn't up, and I couldn't afford to break it. When I returned, something felt different. The air was heavier, stale. I walked through the apartment slowly, flashlight in hand, checking every room. Everything was in place, except for one thing. In the middle of my bed was a single red marble. I didn't own any marbles. I picked it up carefully. It was warm to the touch. Too warm. Like it had been sitting in sunlight, even though the room was dark and cold. I threw it in the trash and took out the garbage immediately. But the next morning, it was back, sitting on my pillow. That was the last straw. I called Rick and told him I was leaving. I didn't care about the lease. I told him I'd forfeit my deposit, clean the place from top to bottom, whatever he wanted, but I was done. He didn't argue. In fact, he almost sounded relieved. As I packed up my things, I noticed more strange objects appearing around the apartment. Old playing cards with faded edges, a child's shoe under the sink, a yellowed photograph of a family I didn't recognize tucked into a kitchen drawer. I didn't take anything with me except what I came in with. I moved into a newer building across town, one with modern wiring and thin walls. No charm, but no spirits either. I haven't seen or heard anything strange since. But sometimes late at night I'll get a sudden chill, or I'll wake up to find my bedroom door cracked open, even though I know I shut it tight. And every once in a while, I find a red marble near my bed. Story the end. It was around late October of 2017 when I moved to a quiet little rental house just outside of Asheville, North Carolina. The house sat at the end of a narrow gravel road, backed by thick woods on 3 sides and far enough from the highway that you couldn't hear traffic unless the wind carried the noise just right. I'd found it through a coworker who said it belonged to her late uncle, and the family just wanted someone there to keep it from falling apart. Rent was cheap, and I'd just gone through a breakup that made staying in my old apartment unbearable. I took it without thinking too hard, figuring the distance from town would help me settle myself mentally and emotionally. The first few weeks were quiet. Too quiet, maybe. I'd grown up in the suburbs where there was always a low hum of something. Lawnmowers, dogs barking, teenagers shouting. Out there, nights were completely still. You could hear a raccoon stepping on dry leaves or a branch cracking 100 yards away. The house itself was in decent shape. 1 bedroom, an open kitchen and living room, and a tiny sunroom that looked out over the slope of the backyard. It was old, though, and you could tell. The floors creaked in places, and the furnace had a habit of clicking 3 or 4 times before it finally kicked on with a rattle. The first time something felt off was the night I decided to move a small bookshelf into the sunroom. I had some old horror novels and weird nonfiction books about hauntings and UFOs that I figured would look good in the natural light. I was arranging them when I heard a knock, not on the front door, but on the glass behind me. I turned fast, and of course, nothing was there. I walked outside and circled the house with a flashlight. Nothing. No animals, no signs of anything disturbed. I tried to brush it off as a branch falling, even though it hadn't been windy at all. Then the dreams started. It wasn't just nightmares. It was like someone else was in my head. I'd fall asleep and find myself walking through the woods behind the house, barefoot, even though I could feel the cold soil and sharp twigs. There was always fog, and I always ended up at the same place. A hollowed-out tree, black and gaping like a mouth. I never went inside in the dreams, but I'd wake up with my sheets twisted around my legs like I'd been trying to run. A few days later, I noticed something strange about the sunroom. The air in there was always colder than the rest of the house, even when the heater was running full blast. It didn't feel like a draft. It felt like something settled. I tried to ignore it, but I started keeping the door to the sunroom closed at night. I even put a towel against the bottom crack, like it might stop whatever was leaking out from seeping into the rest of the house. I didn't mention any of this to my coworkers. They already thought I was a little intense, and I didn't need to fuel any more gossip. But I started doing research. I found old property records and learned the land had been in the same family since the early 1800s. The house I was living in wasn't the original. It had burned down in 1968. No one ever figured out how the fire started. A man named Arthur Bell had lived there with his wife and daughter. The wife died in the fire. The daughter survived and moved away. Arthur was never the same. He'd apparently wandered into the woods one winter and was found weeks later frozen and half buried in a hollow tree. That stopped me cold. A hollow tree. Just like in my dreams. I tried to convince myself it was coincidence, that I must have read the detail somewhere and forgotten and my brain was recycling it. But that explanation felt too clean. One night, around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up needing to pee. As I walked past the sunroom door, I heard something from inside. A soft, dragging sound, like fabric sliding across the floor. I froze. My skin felt electrified. I didn't open the door. I didn't even breathe. I waited there, hand half outstretched, listening. The sound came again, long and slow, and then something tapped the glass. Not a knock, more like fingernails. I backed away, walked back to my room, and locked the door. I lay in bed with my eyes wide open until the sky outside turned from black to gray. When I checked the sunroom later that morning, nothing had moved, no signs of anything. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had watched me hesitate outside that door. I started sleeping with the TV on after that. Low volume, just background noise to fill the silence. The dreams didn't stop, but they became more vivid. In one, I saw the woman who died in the fire. I was standing inside the burning house, only it wasn't destroyed yet, and she was staring at me from the kitchen. Her face wasn't burnt. She looked tired, sad, like she hadn't slept in decades. She whispered something, but I couldn't hear the words. When I woke up, the smell of smoke clung to my sheets. I finally decided to tell someone. I called the coworker who'd given me the rental lead, Rachel. She was quiet when I described the dreams and the cold sunroom and the tapping glass. Then she said, "I should have warned you. My uncle, he was strange after his wife died. People thought he lost his mind, but he'd say she was still in the house, that she talked to him at night. My mom said he'd set up a rocking chair in the sunroom facing the backyard, said it was her favorite spot. That night I went into the sunroom. I stood in the center and looked around. The air was freezing, and it smelled faintly of damp earth and something old, like a closed-up attic. I said out loud, "I don't know what you want, but this is my home now." I didn't really expect anything to happen. I just wanted to try. I didn't sleep well that night, but nothing weird happened. No dragging sounds, no tapping. The next morning, I found something odd on the floor of the sunroom. A small black button, old-fashioned, with a crack running through the middle. I hadn't seen it before, and it didn't belong to any of my clothes. I kept it on the windowsill, figuring maybe it was part of the house's history, maybe hers. After that, things calmed down for a little while. I started sleeping more soundly. I even stopped having the dreams for about a week. But then one night I came home from a late shift and found the front door unlocked. I always double-checked the lock when I left. I was sure of it. Inside, nothing looked disturbed. But when I walked into the sunroom, the button was gone from the windowsill. In its place was a curl of burned paper, black at the edges, brittle. I couldn't make out any words. The next morning, I found scratches on the inside of the back door. 3 long vertical lines, like something with nails had scraped it. I moved out a week later. It's been years now. I live in Richmond, Virginia, in an apartment with noisy neighbors and too much traffic. I still sleep with the TV on. Sometimes I dream about the woods, and sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night, I think I hear something tapping softly on the window. Story the end. It was a chilly autumn evening in a small town nestled deep in the heart of New England. The kind of town where everyone knew each other's names, and the streets were lined with ancient maples that painted the sidewalks with amber and crimson leaves. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a bruised shade of purple, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. Emma, a young woman in her late 20s, had recently moved to this town to start fresh. She had taken a job as a librarian in the town's modest library, an old brick building that had stood for over a century, the kind of place that smelled of worn leather books and dust, with creaky wooden floors and towering shelves that stretched up to a ceiling painted with faded stars. Emma had chosen a quaint Victorian house on the edge of town, that one that looked like it had been plucked from the pages of a ghost story itself. The house was 2 stories tall, painted white, but chipped with age, its windows framed with delicate, ornate woodwork. It sat just where the paved road gave way to a dirt path leading into the dense woods beyond. Locals rarely ventured into those woods after dark, warning each other of strange noises and shadows that danced just beyond sight. On her first night in the house, Emma unpacked boxes by the light of a single lamp, the soft glow casting long, flickering shadows on the peeling wallpaper. She had arrived late in the afternoon, tired from the drive and eager to settle in. After a quick dinner, she climbed into bed, pulling the heavy quilt up around her and listening to the wind rustle through the trees outside. Sleep came quickly, but it was restless. Around midnight, Emma awoke to the sound of faint footsteps echoing through the empty rooms downstairs. At first, she thought it might be the wind playing tricks or perhaps the old house settling, but the footsteps were deliberate and slow, like someone pacing. Her heart quickened as she strained to listen, the sounds growing clearer. They stopped right beneath her bedroom window. Emma's breath caught as a chill swept through the room. She reached for her phone, but it was on the charger in the living room. Summoning courage, she slipped out of bed and padded quietly to the door. The house was deathly silent, except for the soft creak of floorboards under her feet. She hesitated before peeking out into the dim hallway. The footsteps had ceased. Emma's eyes adjusted to the darkness. The hallway stretched to the front door, a tall oak door with a frosted glass window, etched with intricate designs. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She moved closer, heart in her throat, and glanced through the glass. The front porch was empty, bathed in the silver glow of the moon. She exhaled slowly and turned back toward her room. But just as she reached the stairs, she caught sight of something moving in the corner of her eye. A shadow flickered at the edge of the hallway, a faint, misty outline of a figure standing motionless, watching her. Emma froze, her body rigid, her mind scrambling to rationalize what she was seeing. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished. The next morning, Emma told herself it had been a trick of the light, her imagination fueled by loneliness and the creaks of an old house. But the footsteps continued over the next few nights, slow, measured, pacing just outside her door or beneath her window. Sometimes she heard whispers, soft and unintelligible, brushing against her ears like a cold breath. At work, she confided in the town's librarian, Mr. Harris, a kindly older man who had lived in the town his entire life. He listened thoughtfully and nodded. "Ah, the old Whitmore place," he said, using the name of Emma's house. "You're living in a house with a history. Strange things have been said about it for years." Emma pressed him for details, curiosity overcoming caution. "It was built back in the late 1800s by a man named Charles Whitmore," he began. "He was a recluse, a scholar obsessed with the occult. They say he dabbled in things best left alone. One night, he vanished without a trace. Some folks believe he was taken by the spirits he tried to command." Emma felt a shiver crawl down her spine. "Since then," Mr. Harris continued, "neighbors have reported strange noises, lights in the windows when no one's home, shadows moving on their own. The house has a reputation, but people like to say it's just stories." That night, Emma tried to calm her nerves with a cup of chamomile tea. She sat by the fireplace, the flickering flames casting comforting warmth across the room. The house was quiet, and she almost believed the stories were just that, stories. But just as she was about to head to bed, a soft tapping began at the window. She froze. The tapping came again, 3 quick knocks. Her heart pounded as she stood and walked cautiously to the window. Outside, the yard was empty, the branches swaying in the breeze. Then she noticed something unusual, a single pale white rose lying just beyond the glass, resting on the porch steps. Emma felt an odd mixture of fear and fascination. She slipped on her shoes and stepped outside, picking up the rose carefully. It was fresh, delicate, and emitted a faint scent of lavender. Returning inside, she placed the rose on the mantelpiece and locked the door behind her. That night, sleep was elusive. Around 2 a.m., Emma awoke to a whispering voice, clear as day, but no one was there. The voice murmured her name over and over, weaving through the darkness like a cold breeze. The next morning, Emma found the rose had withered, its petals curling and darkening as if time itself had been compressed around it. She felt the weight of unseen eyes watching her, and the presence of the house shifted from eerie to oppressive. Determined to understand more, Emma dug through the town archives at the library. She unearthed old newspaper clippings about Charles Whitmore, the original owner. One article detailed how he had lost his beloved wife, Eliza, to a sudden illness shortly after the house was built. It mentioned that he often left white roses on her grave, and that after her death, strange lights and sounds were reported near the house. Emma began to suspect the ghostly occurrences were connected to Eliza's restless spirit. One night, she decided to confront whatever was haunting the house. She set a small white rose on the windowsill, lit a candle, and spoke aloud. "Eliza, if you're here, I mean no harm. I just want to understand." The air grew colder, the flame flickered violently, and the whispering returned. This time it was clearer, a soft, sorrowful voice pleading, "Help me." Emma's breath caught. She asked, "How can I help?" The voice whispered, "Find the locket." The next day, Emma searched the house carefully, her hands trembling. In the attic, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, she found a small, tarnished silver locket. Inside was a faded photograph of a young woman, Eliza, no doubt. That evening, Emma held the locket and spoke to the empty room. "I found it." "What now?" The temperature dropped sharply, and the whisper returned, "Bring me home." Emma was confused. Home? Where? The voice was faint but insistent. "The garden, under the old oak." Emma stepped outside, the night crisp and still. She walked to the ancient oak tree in the back garden. There, she began to dig with her bare hands, the cold soil clinging to her skin. After several minutes, her fingers brushed something hard, a small wooden box. Inside, wrapped in delicate lace, lay Eliza's remains along with several white roses pressed between the pages of a worn diary. Emma sat back, heart heavy. She realized the spirit was trapped, longing for peace. The next morning, she arranged for a proper burial of the remains in the town cemetery, ensuring Eliza would finally rest with dignity. That night, the house felt different. The air was lighter, warmer. Emma slept deeply for the first time in weeks. From then on, the footsteps ceased. The whispers stopped. The house was quiet, but comforting. Emma still found a white rose on her windowsill from time to time, but now it felt like a gentle reminder. A thank you from a spirit finally at peace. Story the end. It was a cold October night in Vermont when Lisa decided to visit the small town of Bennington, known mostly for its historic landmarks and the famous Bennington Battle Monument. She was a documentary filmmaker interested in local legends and folklore, and Vermont's sleepy towns with their centuries-old histories were perfect for her next project. Lisa loved stories about hauntings and ghost sightings, but unlike most people who sought thrills, she approached these tales with skepticism and a keen eye for facts. She wanted to find the truth behind the legends. Lisa arrived in Bennington just before dusk, the sky a dull gray, the wind whispering through the dense woods that hugged the town's edges. She checked into a small bed and breakfast run by an elderly couple who seemed welcoming, but a little wary when she mentioned she was interested in the paranormal. Over dinner, the owner, Mrs. Thompson, cautiously shared a story about a house on the outskirts of town known as the Easton House, which had been abandoned for decades but was rumored to be haunted. "What happened there?" Lisa asked, intrigued. Mrs. Thompson lowered her voice. "Years ago, a family lived there, the Eastons. They disappeared one night. No one ever found out why. Some say you can still hear the mother's lullaby on quiet nights or see a figure standing by the window. The locals avoid it, especially after dark." Lisa nodded, her curiosity piqued. "Do you think it's true?" Mrs. Thompson shrugged. "I don't know, dear, but there's something about that place. It feels off." After dinner, Lisa walked back to her room, her mind buzzing with possibilities. The Easton house was about 2 miles out of town, near the edge of a thick forest. She decided to visit it the next day, hoping to gather some footage and interviews with locals who might know more. The next morning, Lisa rented a bike and headed toward the Easton house. The road grew narrower and more rugged, lined with towering trees whose branches knit together overhead, casting shadows even in daylight. When she arrived, the house was everything she had expected: old, weather-beaten, and overrun with vines and weeds. The windows were broken and the door hung slightly ajar. Lisa took out her camera and started filming. She walked slowly around the property, capturing the eerie atmosphere. Inside, the house smelled of dust and rot. Old furniture lay overturned, and the wallpaper peeled in large strips. The floorboards creaked under her steps. She imagined the Easton family living there, the kids playing in the rooms, the mother singing lullabies as the fire crackled in the hearth. As she moved from room to room, Lisa's recorder picked up faint noises, whispers she couldn't understand, the soft creak of footsteps, even though she was alone. She paused, holding her breath, but nothing was visible. Brushing it off as the house settling or wind through the broken windows, she continued filming. Suddenly, a cold draft swept through the room, making her shiver. Lisa glanced toward the staircase and noticed a shadow flicker at the top landing. She blinked, and it was gone. Her heart rate quickened. Lisa decided it was time to talk to the locals. She returned to town and visited the library, hoping to find old newspaper articles or records about the Easton family. She discovered that the family had vanished in 1947. The police had found no evidence of a struggle or foul play, and the house had been left untouched since then. Some townspeople believed the family had been cursed or taken by something supernatural. Lisa spoke with an older man named Mr. Jenkins, who had lived in Bennington all his life. He told her he had seen strange lights near the Easton house as a boy, and sometimes heard the faint sound of a child crying late at night. "That house isn't right," he said. "People say the mother still watches over the place, waiting for her family to come home." Lisa spent the next few days interviewing more residents, gathering stories, and trying to piece together what had happened. She noticed that while many dismissed the tales as ghost stories, a few seemed genuinely unsettled by the thought of the Easton house. On her last night in Bennington, Lisa felt compelled to return to the house one final time. She brought only her camera and a flashlight, determined to get some conclusive evidence. The night was moonless, the woods around the house seeming to press in on her as she walked up the path. The air was thick and cold. As she approached, a soft melody drifted from inside. The same lullaby Mrs. Thompson had mentioned. Lisa's skin prickled. She hesitated, then stepped inside. The house was darker than before, the shadows seeming to move just beyond the reach of her flashlight. The lullaby grew louder, more distinct. It was a woman's voice, gentle but sad. Lisa moved toward the source, climbing the staircase slowly. At the top, she saw a faint figure standing by the window, an apparition of a woman in an old-fashioned dress, her face pale and eyes distant. The woman turned slowly, and Lisa caught a glimpse of tears streaming down her translucent cheeks. Lisa's breath caught. The ghostly figure spoke in a whisper, "Come home." The air grew icy. The house seemed to groan and shift. Lisa felt a sudden, overwhelming sadness wash over her, a feeling of loss so deep it almost crushed her. She stumbled back down the stairs, heart pounding, and ran out of the house into the night. Back in town, Lisa reviewed the footage. The camera had captured the flickering shadow, the soft lullaby, and a faint outline of the woman at the window. She left Bennington the next morning, her skepticism replaced with a respectful awe. Years later, Lisa would still think about that night and the Easton family. The haunting wasn't about malevolence, but a sorrow that lingered, a mother's love lost in time, still waiting for her family to return. Story, the end.